Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Snowdon, the Biography, by Decourcy, narrated by Theo Solomon.
Chapter 1. The Other Son. On the 6th of May, 1960, Antony Armstrong-Jones stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, his new bride by his side, and a cheering mass of over 30,000 spectators below. It was an extraordinary, intoxicating moment, so overwhelming that at the time his mind was blank. He was 30 years old, he was at the peak of his profession, and he had just married the sister of the Queen of England. What else was there left to do or conquer? For some people, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. For others, it is fame, money, or social success. The twin motivating forces in the life of Antony Armstrong-Jones were work and sex, both backed by immense, charismatic charm and a drive and determination unfettered by many of the usual constraints. The relationships this complex, inflammable mix involved were shaped not only by his own nature, but, as with so many of us, by the attitudes of those who surrounded him in his early life. This is his story. Antony Charles Robert Armstrong-Jones, always known as Tony, was born on the 7th of March, 1930. Although there were brains and talent on both sides of his family, and considerable wealth on one, there was nothing to indicate the extraordinary life that he himself would lead. His parentage was a mingling of Welsh, Jewish, and English. His father, Ronald Owen Armstrong-Jones, born on the 18th of May, 1899, and called to the bar of the Middle Temple in 1922, was Welsh to his fingertips. Ronnie, as he was always known, was the son of the brilliant surgeon Robert Jones. Their antecedents included Welsh farmers, ship owners, a high sheriff of Carnarvonshire, and, it is believed, King Edward I of England. Ronnie's mother Margaret, who brought the Carnarvonshire estate of Plasdinas into the family, was the daughter of Sir Owen Roberts, who also owned the Surrey estate of Henley Park. But by the time Ronnie inherited it in 1943, the original 800 acres had shrunk to extensive grounds and 14 acres of parkland. Tony's mother, Anne Messel, daughter of the wealthy banker Leonard Messel and his wife Maud, had a more exotic heritage. The originator of the Messel family fortune was the banker Aaron Messel of Darmstadt, whose grandson Ludwig Messel, also a banker in the family firm, settled in London soon after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, converting from Judaism to Christianity when he married. Alfred Messel, Ludwig's brother, who remained in Germany, became so famous that he was known as the Kaiser's architect. He designed the Berlin National Gallery, as well as various opulent private palaces, and was the first architect to use steel and glass through several floors. Later, his great-nephew Tony was to show the same innovative streak. Berlin's Messelplatz and Messelstrasse were named after Alfred. By 1890, Ludwig had prospered to such an extent that he was able to buy the beautiful 900-acre Nyman's estate at Handcross in West Sussex, inherited by his son Leonard after his death. From the outset, much of his time was spent in creating the famous Nyman's Gardens, now the property of the National Trust. 5 years after leaving Oxford, Leonard Messel married Maud, the daughter of the famous Punch artist Linley Sambourne, whose London house in Kensington, 18 Stafford Terrace, remained in the family until 1980, when it was sold to the Greater London Council. Their 2 sons, Linley and Oliver, were born in 1899 and 1904 respectively, Their daughter Anne on the 8th of February, 1902. Anne, educated at home and presented at court in June 1922, grew up to be one of London's reigning beauties, known throughout society not only for her lovely face and slender figure, but for her exquisite, Art Deco-inspired clothes made for her in London and Paris. Her costumes at the fancy dress balls so popular in the 20s were famous, designed by her younger brother Oliver, who had emerged as a celebrated creator of stage sets and costumes, most notably for the popular series of Cochrane Reviews. The two were close. Oliver, short, dark-haired, extrovert, giggly, though he could also cry at will, was an enchanting companion of immaculate taste. When Anne met the young barrister Ronald Armstrong-Jones through her brother Linley, who had rowed in the same crew at Magdalen College, Oxford, it was for Ronnie love at first sight. Soon Anne, too, found that she was in love, and a few months after their meeting, they were engaged. When they married on the 22nd of July, 1925, Ronnie was 26 and Anne 23. It was a glittering society wedding at St. Margaret's, Westminster, and on the surface there appeared to be all the omens for a long, happy, and fruitful union. The bride was young, beautiful, and rich, the groom good-looking and charismatic, with the promise of a brilliant career at the bar. They settled in the house given by Leonard Messel to his daughter as a wedding present, 25 Eaton Terrace in Belgravia. Its Baroque decoration, tempered by Siri Morm white, owed much to Oliver. Here the young couple's first child, Susan Mary, was born on the 12th of February 1927, and their second, Tony, 3 years later. All seemed set fair. But within the next year, the marriage had begun to unravel. Ronnie needed to focus on his work to establish himself in his career at the bar. The mundane Anne found her deepest satisfaction in the world of clothes and parties and the theatrical milieu of her brother Oliver. She was metropolitan and image-conscious to her fingertips. Ronnie was flamboyant, unpunctual, and fond of outdoor sports such as shooting and fishing. Among the mirrored glass witch balls and febrile chatter of friends like Cecil Beaton, he felt like a fish out of water. Conversely, bar gossip or serious discussion of cases were the last things that interested the glittering Anne. As she observed, Ronnie loved going out and girls, adding crisply, but not my type of either. Although the marriage broke down irrevocably in 1931, appearances were kept up for another 2 years, and it was not until 1933 that they separated. Ronnie hoped that the separation would not be permanent, but as Anne pointed out, actually, he was well rooted in another romp by this time. For him, it was the beginning of a gypsy-like existence that led from house to house and woman to woman. That winter, he acquired the lease of 6 Trevor Square, Knightsbridge, conveniently near Hyde Park for the children and their nanny, Laura Gunner. Anne and Ronnie had agreed to share the children equally between them. Their decree nisi was granted on the 22nd of February, 1935. The decree absolute on the 28th of August. 3 weeks later, on the 19th of September 1935, Anne married Michael Parsons, who had succeeded the Earldom of Ross at the age of 12 when his father was killed in action in 1918. He was 4 years younger than Anne, and in every worldly sense a catch, a kind, generous, and good-looking man who had inherited the romantic Burgh Castle in County Offaly, Ireland, set in its estate of 26,500 acres, and Womersley Park in West Yorkshire. The family fortune had been founded on nearby coal mines. As the wife of a rich man, and chatelaine of 2 grand estates, Anne was in her element, her innate talents exactly fitting her new role. She was not Oliver's sister for nothing. Her houses were always splendidly decorated, and she took immense trouble over every detail of their running. She could sew beautifully. She often designed and made her own Christmas cards, interleaving them with a piece of dark green tissue paper to protect and preserve the reproduction, and she was a knowledgeable and creative gardener. Their life followed a pattern, moving according to the seasons from house to house. She and Michael would progress in their chauffeur-driven cars, neither of them could drive, from Burr to her house in Eaton Terrace, to Nyman's and then to Womersley, often taking in 18 Stafford Terrace, which her mother had persuaded her to use as a pied-à-terre. Her social career went from strength to strength, as did her image of herself as the most beautiful and spectacular woman in any gathering. Dressed in dramatic silks and velvets in dual colours from Molyneux, Schiaparelli, or Victor Steibel, wearing the famous Ross emeralds or the 5 Womersley diamond stars, she would pause, as if for applause when she entered a theatre, opera house, or ball. Hugely socially ambitious, she became known as Tugboat Annie, because she goes from pier to pier, ran the joke, and her earlier marriage and everything connected with it were quickly consigned to oblivion. The children could not be so dismissed, but when on the 21st of October, 1936, and the 23rd of December, 1938, William Clare Leonard Brendan Wilmer Parsons, Viscount Oxmantown, and his brother, the Honourable Desmond Oliver Martin Parsons, were born, without question her Armstrong-Jones offspring took second place. As both Tony and Susan resembled their father rather than her, in colouring as well as in appearance, there may have been some unconscious wish to push everything connected with the divorce into the background of her mind. What maternal attention she had, as this was in the days when a brief morning encounter and an hour after tea was considered normal for upper-class parents and children, was lavished on her 2 Parsons sons. On both Tony and Susan, although of course neither realized it at the time, the effect of this downgrading was damaging in the extreme. Tony was only 5 when his parents divorced. It was an era when divorce was rare, conspicuous, and poorly regarded, its traces marking those it touched even peripherally. For Tony and Susan, it meant primarily both isolation and shuttling between 2 different and opposed worlds, the formal, nanny-led ambience of Burr Castle, their mother's new domain, and the life favoured by Ronnie, the carefree atmosphere of Plasdinas, and the small terrace house in First Street, Chelsea, full of theatrical friends. In 1936, he had married a vivacious, athletic Australian actress from Perth, Carol Coombe. Wednesday, the 18th of June. Daddy and Carol married, wrote the 6-year-old Tony in his small pocket diary, going on to list his daily intake of sweets. The divorce had been acrimonious, and resentment still hung like a cloud over the children's lives, discernible to them by the crossness their arrival seemed to produce in the other parent, each of whom had them for half the school holidays. Anne, who admired the romantic little Lord Fauntleroy look, would send Tony back to his father in pale blue velvet, his blonde locks down to his shoulders. Ronnie, after a holiday at Plasdinas, with its beach barbecues and boating, would return Tony in battered grey flannel shorts with his hair, cut on the last day before his return, as short as possible. The children were sent off from London by train to Holyhead, and then on the mailboat to Dunleary, where the Rosses' chauffeur, Hoisted, would meet them and drive them to Burr in the Humber. Sometimes in the summer, Hoisted would take all the children on a day-long picnic to Connemara, to look for amethysts on the beach, or to Galway to bathe. Letters and affidavits passed snappishly between the two parents. Anne Ross aimed much of her venom at Ronnie's breezy new wife, Carol. I am compelled to say that the condition and mental attitude of the children each time they return to me, apart from specific instances, have led me to consider that Mrs. Armstrong-Jones is not a responsible person to have in charge of the upbringing of my daughter. In the case of my son, there have been occasions illustrating Mrs. Armstrong-Jones's complete irresponsibility with regard to matters of health which show, in my opinion, that she is not capable of ever having complete charge of children. Ronnie responded that his wife, the daughter of the respected Sir Thomas and Lady Combe, was very fond of the children, and that Anne's demand that a governess accompany them even if they were with their parents was unreasonable. I submit that the provision that the children shall while with me always be accompanied by a governess is neither fair nor necessary, wrote Ronnie. When Anne proposed in February 1937 that Susan should be made to rest every afternoon in a darkened room, Ronnie's response a month later began, "I can only say that I am amazed at the contents of your letter." But he reserved his real broadside for her contention that Susan remain with her during term time. Personal care by someone she loves and trusts is essential for Susan's health and happiness. By pointing out that after Susan had been ill at Nyman's, you did not hesitate to let her undertake the long and tiring journey to Ireland. I also see by your address that at present you are in London, while they are still in Ireland, so it doesn't seem that they are enjoying at the moment your personal supervision which you consider so necessary. For both Tony and Susan, the contrast between their two lives was enormous. If their genial, asthmatic father was down on his luck, they would return from the grandeur of Burr to a small cottage somewhere. If he had had a run of successful cases, it would be to a large and lavishly run house. Discussions about finances were frequent. Ronnie depended on the fees and, although sometimes extravagant, he was extremely aware of and careful with money, a trait inherited by his son. Carol was a warm and uninhibited person, but compared to his mother's cool, impeccable style, Tony began to find her brash and even vulgar. Much later, the divergence in the two parents' lifestyles and the enmity between them was reflected in Tony's alternating attitudes to them. "He was always non-speaks with one or the other," said Princess Margaret. Always close, the two children became still closer. Susan the sweet-natured, protective older sister, Tony the naughty little brother whom she adored, supported, and frequently got out of trouble, in a pattern that would be repeated throughout their lives. For a long time, the central figure in their lives was their nanny, Laura Gunner, who loved both of them dearly, and as a consequence felt keenly the subordinate position they held in their mother's affections vis-à-vis her two Ross sons. Because of the children's peripatetic lifestyle, the lack of contact with their mother was accentuated. When they went to stay with their maternal grandparents, whether or not their mother was there, it was not even the same house. Instead, it was in a much smaller establishment on the other side of the road in the village, where they lived together with Nanny Gunner and Susan's governess, Miss Martin, Marty. From here, 6-year-old Tony and Susan, aged 9, went across to see their grandparents after lunch. Tony was later to describe his grandfather as a grumpy little bugger, very self-important, very Jewish. But both children adored their serene, beautiful grandmother and respected her wisdom. It was at Nyman's that Tony first became conscious of the house that was to mean more to him than any other, and to which he would remain faithful for far longer than to any of the women who would later figure in his life. For him, Old House, as it was called, would always represent the magic, the happiness and the sense of a private world in which anything is possible, evoking the childhood, secure and happy with his sister and Nanny, that in many ways he never outgrew. This small dwelling, tucked away in the Nyman's woods, was just under 2 miles away from the big house, and its 30-acre garden down the bumpy Nyman's Drive, and a mile from the village of Staplefield Green. It was originally an ironmaster's house dating back to 1471. Then 2 Tudor workmen's cottages which were knocked into one, and a Georgian facade added. The cottage windows still retained the original leaded lights. The oldest walls were hung with red tiles. The roof was tiled, and the great beam above the hall fireplace bore the date 1672. It had no lighting or heating, and a sandpit sufficed for plumbing. The children adored it. On summer afternoons they would walk through the wood with Nanny Gunner to find a tea of cucumber sandwiches, bread and butter and honey laid out ready for them. Sometimes, when they went to draw the pure spring water from the well in the garden, they would be greeted by the call of a cuckoo. One of the gardeners could mimic the bird exactly. At other times there would be Easter egg hunts round the old house garden, and fishing in the nearby lake for pike. Although the Armstrong-Jones children were in the same house as their mother when they went to her at Burr, there was, if possible, even more formality than at Nyman's. All the children lived at the top floor, the domain of Nanny Gunner, and the rooms they could enter, and by which door, were severely regulated. The Georgian Gothic saloon, with its beautiful 18th-century Waterford chandelier and 1870 flock wallpaper, was out of bounds, as was the drawing-room and the small library. Dining-room lunch was governed by strict protocol. While adults, the Rosses and their many guests, entered by the main door from the hall to eat 5 or 6 courses in this imposing room, with its dark red wallpaper hung densely with family portraits, the children were forbidden to use any but the children's door. Through this, at the other side of the room, they would file in decorously after the first course or two, to sit with Nanny and any visiting governess or tutor at a small round table near the window. After they had eaten their 2 courses, Anne Ross, sitting at the near end of the long mahogany dining table that could seat 16, would give them their signal for dismissal by turning her chair round and inquiring, "And what are the children doing this afternoon?" In the nursery, a sunny room with a brass fender rocking horse and a cupboard full of toys, the boys as well as Susan would play with a doll's house. This was made by the estate carpenter, Willie Eads, with whom Tony spent as much time as possible, and was a model of the Georgian houses that later caused Burr to be listed as a Georgian heritage town. Sometimes, when they knew adults were out of the way, the boys would slide down the polished yew-wood banisters surrounding the square stairwell that rose from the hall. For more freedom, they would retreat to a room in the tower, where they were amply forewarned of Nanny Gunner's approach by the creaking of her knees as she slowly mounted the stairs. Outside, there was the endless game of pushing each other down the rough, grassy sides of the moat, or, on wet days, pulling each other along in the trolleys that ran along under the ceiling of the 100-foot turf house, where the 1,600 donkey loads of peat that was the year's supply of fuel for Burr was stacked. The template of Tony's subsequent life was largely laid down in these early years. Moving between school, 2 sets of parents, and often to a house different from the one in which he had stayed on the previous holiday. In all, Ronnie moved 27 times during his lifetime, inculcated his habit of compartmentalizing not only the different aspects of his life, but also the people in them. Later on, A wife might suddenly discover that someone she thought was a stranger to her husband had known him well for 20 years, or there would be a sudden mysterious disappearance that remained unexplained. His childhood feelings for his mother were, in turn, responsible for much of the complexity of his later relationships with women. He was simultaneously dazzled by this glittering figure and resentful of a lack of attention that amounted to rejection. And it is a psychological truth that a child who has not had proper mothering often not only cannot form a relationship with a woman in later life, but also cannot trust women, sometimes to the extent of wanting to be the first to strike a blow, or, as the psychologist Perry London has observed, parent-child interactions are the main area from which individual adjustment patterns develop. As a parent, Anne was distant and aloof. Even when there was too much noise from the nursery floor, she would not mount the stairs herself to demand quietness, but send her husband up instead to remonstrate. Her preferred style was to be worshipped rather than to hug and kiss, while, like all little boys, Tony longed for her love and approval. His schoolboy diary is full of remarks about Mummy. Nor did it help that she often referred to him as her ugly son, or that she would introduce the Parsons boys as my sons, forgetting Tony, hovering in the background. "Oh, and this is my other son," she would say on these occasions if a visitor asked who he was. The pattern of enthrallment to her glamour and simultaneous, albeit unconscious anger at being either ignored or passed over in favor of his younger siblings manifested itself later in, among other things, an attraction to the beautiful and a destructive urge to push against the boundaries of a relationship until the hapless partner finally conceded defeat. With his mother's affection not forthcoming, Tony sought the next best thing: attention. This was most easily achieved by naughtiness. The awareness that her Parsons children, in particular the heir William, were his mother's focus added a certain childish malice to such mischievousness. Later this would surface in the touch of cruelty with which many of his jokes and repartee were edged. With others, he quickly learned that as a golden-haired, blue-eyed, smiling little boy, charm was an infallible weapon to use on grown-ups. This, too, was to prove irresistible in adult life. His sister Susan suffered as much, if not more, from their mother's dismissiveness. Anne was devoted to her niece Victoria Messel, the daughter of her brother Linley, and when Victoria was staying, would often say fondly, "She's my daughter," adding, if Susan were there, "Oh, and that's my other daughter." Susan, shy and sensitive, felt this deeply, but her reaction was the opposite of Tony's, to gain the longed-for approval by being as good as possible. From early on, Tony was at ease. An agile child, he would climb the tallest trees at Burr, and then scream that he was stuck and could not get down. As his wails became ever more terrified and pathetic, the devoted Nanny Gunner, risking life and limb, would climb up to help him. As she neared him, he would shin quickly down the other side of the tree, leaving her helplessly aloft, and stroll nonchalantly into lunch as if nothing had happened. Once, driven beyond endurance, she chastised him with an ivory hairbrush. But as usual his luck held, and the brush broke. There was further bickering between his parents when Tony went to his preparatory school, Sandroyd, then near Cobham, Surrey. Both Anne and Ronnie accepted that as Tony had only had a governess education thus far, apart from a brief spell at the all-girls Francis Holland School in Graham Terrace, London, after which he became their only old boy, he would initially find the work difficult and be backward compared with boys who had attended pre-prep schools. His father organized his...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?